Siegel. Thanks very much for signing on to this course. I hope you get a lot out of it. I'm Paul Siegel, one of the creators. Spent a lot of time designing and developing courses for organizations around the world and for groups of students. One of the things I've found is it's very important to get engaged with your instructor. What does that mean? That means ask questions. We're here to support you. We try to respond as quickly as possible, and we try to amplify the content on the course. If you're not seeing something such as you want more exercises, you want more videos, that's what we do. We also build custom courses for the largest organizations. So if you're one of those organizations and need that kind of content, just reach out to us. It's easy to find us on the web. We're here to help education become really meaningful, useful, and practical in the day-to-day lives of yourself, you, if you're the student, or your team members, if you're an organization. Thanks very much. See you online.
Let's talk about the subject of the securities trade life cycle. So what are we attempting to cover in this? Well, for anybody that for which the securities trade life cycle is a new subject, or for people maybe that have been involved to some extent in it, we will be looking to cover the following. All of the components of the securities trade life cycle. And now we'll be looking at this in the processing sequence. There is a logical sequence to which a securities trade needs to be processed, and we'll be looking at the processing impact as well of this. The subject of straight-through processing is a very important subject from a financial institution's perspective, including investment banks, and so we'll be looking at what causes STP to occur, but also what prevents it from occurring. Primary risks and typical mitigating controls. So we will see that there are lots of risks in the processing of securities trades, and therefore there is the need for many controls to mitigate such risks. And generally speaking, there will be a number of market-wide terms that we use within the securities trade processing. So let's look at an overview to begin with of what the securities trade life cycle is. It's a series of steps through which any trade passes from placing an order, which we're going to see is at the very top of the process, right the way through to settlement of the trade. Some people would call it completion of the trade. So here's our roadmap. What you can see here is that in the very big box, this is intended to be the perspective of a financial institution. Now, what do we mean by that? This would incorporate what an investment bank needs to process in terms of any trade that they execute, but also it's the same process for buy-side firms such as a mutual fund, pension fund, insurance company, hedge fund. All firms that execute trades in securities, and by that, by the way, I mean equities and bonds, must go through this same process. But this is from primarily an investment bank's perspective. Why am I saying that? Because actually there is a front office, let's assume that to be a system in the front and a separate system in the back office, which I'm going to refer to as operations. That's not always the case, by the way, where you are maybe a pension fund or an insurance company, because under those circumstances you typically have just a single system. But a typical scenario in an investment bank, two separate systems. So firstly then, even before a trade is executed, if you look at this process here and say, well, what we're trying to do after buying and selling, the act of trade execution that is, the whole purpose of the trade life cycle is to end up down here with the trade having settled on its due date. That is the objective of the trade life cycle. But even before you execute a trade, what do you need in place? You need this box here to be in place, static data. Some people will call this reference data. So what is it? It holds information within static data regarding the security that you're trading, whether it's equity or bond. It's the same concept. You need that information about the individual security to be stored in your static data, and the other information you need is with regard to your counterparty, in other words, the party from whom you are buying or to whom you are selling. Information about the security and of the counterparty needs to be in here, ideally, before a trade is executed, because this enables straight-through processing. If you execute a trade where you don't have, for example, the counterparty set up in here, it won't stop you executing the trade, but it will prevent very smooth automated processing throughout the entire life cycle. Okay, so very quickly then, if we run through what each of these steps means in an overview sense. In the front office, you have the execution of the trade. So this is the trader within your organization has agreed to buy from a particular counterparty or sell to a particular counterparty. That is the act of trade execution. What should happen immediately after trade execution? The trade should be captured in the trader's front office system. What actually gets captured here is what I would describe as being the trade skeleton. These are the minimum details associated with the trade. We will be looking at what those details are, about 7 pieces of information. Once a trade has been successfully captured in the front, and by the way, in the front office system, that is reliant upon static data to be present in order for you to successfully capture the trade. Once a trade has been captured, there's an interface between the front office system and operations system that's represented by this line. And the trade will be sent down the interface. This is likely to happen within seconds of the trade being captured in the front office system. But it now needs to be captured in the back office system. These are 2 separate systems. So if a trade has been successfully captured there, unfortunately there is still no guarantee that the trade will be successfully captured in the back. Why? Because the operations system also is reliant upon static data. So static data could be present in the front but not in the back, and that will prevent successful trade capture in the back. What does that mean? Success in the front, no success in the back. It means immediately your link between the trade that you've now captured in the front is not now represented in the back, and this will become a reconciliation issue, which we don't want. So monitoring of the interface, monitoring successful capture or otherwise here is an extremely important thing. Let's assume that we have successfully captured in the operation system. That's still a trade skeleton there, but we need the full body, not just the skeleton. How do we achieve the full body? We go through a process called trade enrichment, and that again uses static data, and we will then turn this skeleton into a full body. Let's assume that that has happened. So the next step then is the subject of trade confirmation. What is this subject? It is making certain that the details that we have captured internally are agreed by the counterparty. So if I can suggest, if you can visualize that the counterparty is over here, and that's the party with whom we executed the trade, the counterparty will be going through the exact same process internally. So, but is it possible to end up with different details? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, it is. Okay, so the trade confirmation process then is designed to ensure that the detail of each individual transaction that we have captured internally is the same as the counterparty. Let's say counterparty is over here. So we're going to communicate with them. That could be us sending a communication to the counterparty, or it could actually be the other way around. What we'll see is that it's also possible to be done electronically. So if you like, a platform that sits in between. Okay, let's assume that we have that we know that our trade details for an individual trade are agreed by the counterparty. What comes next? Answer is the issuance of settlement instructions here. So a settlement instruction is a communication to our settlement agent, and by that I'm referring to these people down here. So this is outside of our own domain. The CSD, so the Central Securities Depository, or the custodian that we have appointed to act on our behalf, that is where settlement is going to occur. That is to whom we need to issue a settlement instruction. At the moment, and up until now, these people know nothing about this trade at all. But this is the equivalent, really, of your bank. If you were in the old days paying a cheque, for example, effectively writing of a cheque is the authority to your bank to make a payment, and effectively that is what's going to happen here. So once we've issued a settlement instruction, what do we then require to as a next stage? We need to know the status, the pre-settlement status of the instruction. We need to know whether it's matched by the counterparty or whether it's unmatched. And if it's unmatched, we need to make sure that we investigate and resolve the reason why it's unmatched. Because for settlement of a securities trade to occur, we need our instruction and the counterparty's instruction to be matched before settlement can occur. So we need to make sure our instructions are matched. Let's assume that our instruction is matched. Then what can happen beyond that is that the trade will fail to settle. Failure to settle means that you've arrived at the due date of settlement and actually the trade has not settled. What do we mean by settlement? The exchange of securities for cash between seller and buyer. And there will be financial implications of that if there is failed settlement. To put this into perspective, failed settlements may occur on, say, 5 to 10% of your trades. Certainly not anything like 50 or 80% of your trades. Now let's assume that settlement has occurred. How do we know it's occurred? Because we would have received a communication from our CSD or custodian to tell us that the trade has actually settled. So this is that the exchange of securities for cash has in fact occurred. That's fine, that's exactly what we wanted, but what we must now do is internally reflect the fact that settlement has occurred for the individual transaction. Why do we need to do that? Because up until now, this trade has a status of open with the counterparty. This means there is exposure with the counterparty. When settlement occurs, there is no longer exposure with the counterparty, in fact, and that is the case here at the CSD or custodian that we're using, but our books and records need to be updated to reflect exactly the same thing. And having then done that, we would then need to reconcile. We would need to make sure, for example, that the holdings that are reported to us by the CSD or the custodian that we are using are exactly the same as we have within our internal books and records. This is an extremely important process. Okay, so now let's move ahead then. So what does this trade life cycle include? Both internal and external management of trades. As you've seen, internal to our organisation, if we're an investment bank, for example, but also external management through the CSD that we are using or the custodian that we are using. And it also relates to both outgoing information, so sending information to our CSD or custodian via a settlement instruction, but also, as you've seen, getting information coming back from them about the status of the instruction and about whether it's failed and whether it has settled. So now we're going to look at the detail of each one of the steps. So what does the broker do when an order is received? Well, it acts as either agent or as principal. And this has legal connotations, actually, for an investment bank in terms of the way that they act on an individual trade basis. So, as agent, the broker attempts to find a third party willing to trade on the terms of the order. Let me just explain. If this is the investment bank here, and if this is the client that's placing the order, this is the order coming into the investment bank. If the investment bank has no position in the security, let's assume that the client wishes to buy a particular quantity of a particular security, then the investment bank could say, no thank you, thanks for your order, but we don't trade in that security. But most investment banks would never want to turn business away from a client. There is no guarantee that the investment bank will want to entertain the order, but on the assumption that they will try and do the best on behalf of the client, then if the investment bank has no position in the particular security, then effectively the investment bank would pass the order on to the market or possibly to an individual investment bank who it thinks may be able to entertain the order. So let's assume that that does happen, and then what we get back is an execution here. So now the investment bank has in fact traded with whoever this party is here. And because of that, then that also happens. Which means that the investment bank has, in the example where the client wished to buy, the investment bank has in fact bought from this party here and sold to the client, leaving a position of 0 in the middle. So how does it make money out of that situation? The answer is that it would charge commission to the client. And so the only thing that should occur, that the investment bank should be left with in its bank account after settlement has occurred of both sides, so just to be clear, it will look like settlement here and then settlement there. What gets left in the investment bank's bank account is the commission. That's the idea. But the alternative is when the client places the order. So I'll draw this again down here, but this is investment bank as agent. I'm going to take the same scenario and describe the investment bank acting in a different capacity. This is as principal. So here's the investment bank. The investment bank, for this particular security, Marks and Spencer shares, already has a position of 55 million. So a positive position of 55 million, potentially being made up of one trade or hundreds of trades. But this is its present position. The client comes along, places an order, just as we discussed up here. Now, the situation is different. We said that the client wanted to buy 10 million Marks and Spencer shares at market price. Now, if you're an investment bank, you receive the order from the client. Now you can sell to the client directly and reduce your position. So let's assume that that's what happens, that the investment bank's trader actually does that. Then this will simply be reduced now by 10 million. So they're now long 45 million. And the execution to the client has now been done. And therefore, following up from this and thinking back to the steps within the trade life cycle, this trade now needs to be settled. I did say that this has legal connotations because if the investment bank states that they have traded, in fact, as agent, then they need ultimately to be able to prove to the market authorities that they really did buy from them at one price and sell to them at precisely the same price and only charge commission here. If you say you act as principal, that implies that you had a position and you've traded off of your book. You'll see that there's no market side to this because the position already existed. Okay, so we just mentioned trading as agent or as principal, and this results in successful execution on terms specified in the order or no execution at all. But of course the investment bank must respond to the client and tell them precisely what they have or may not have done. Let's assume that successful execution has occurred. Then the investment bank must communicate the details of the execution to the client. So this would state you have, meaning the client has, bought 10 million of M&S ordinary shares at this specific price, a price of £6.10 per share. Upon execution, therefore, the broker, the investment bank, becomes counterparty to the trade as far as the client is concerned. So they become counterparty to one another. In a situation where the investment bank has executed a trade with a mutual fund client, so in other words, an organisation that typically has a number of underlying funds, then typically all that the investment bank will know initially is that it's that firm. I gave an example before of Invesco being that firm. But the investment bank will also know that Invesco will want to come back and allocate that 10 million into a number of its underlying funds. Can the investment bank guess what those funds are? No, because some of these fund managers have huge numbers of underlying funds, so it's really not possible to guess. But it is important that the investment bank is informed by the client, and we will talk later on as to why that's important. So at the point of trade execution, all the investment bank might know is that it's Invesco and that 10 million of Marks & Spencer shares have been sold to Invesco at this particular price. At some later point, preferably as quickly as possible, the client, Invesco, needs to respond to the investment bank and tell them how the allocations, or a nickname for allocations is splits, are required to occur. And here is an example of the sort of thing. I'm using QRS here rather than Invesco, but you can see that there's a number of different funds under here, 4 different funds, and this is how QRS wishes that individual trade of 10 million that they've bought to be allocated amongst their underlying funds. You can see here's the breakdown, totaling 10 million, which is obviously important. And here is the price. Well, everything's been given at the same price overall. So what charges does the broker or the investment bank impose for providing the service? It's commission that is in charge, that's charged to the client. So in other words, to the organisation that requires the service. Sometimes this is known as brokerage. What must occur after trade execution for each involved party? So in our example here, we're talking of the mutual fund and of the investment bank, the two different parties to the trade, must record the detail of each trade, and ultimately settlement of the trade must occur. And that is going to occur towards the bottom of our trade life cycle roadmap. So let's assume then that we have executed a trade. So the first thing that needs